All right, good evening. Welcome to the regular meeting and public hearing on June 17th, 2025. Exits are to your rear on the left and behind us on the right. If you would please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. If I could ask the board to state their names, starting on the left here, on your right.
Charles Trout.
Lori Penzi.
Simon Litton.
James Sullivan.
Allison Phillips, counsel.
Bob Freeman.
Elizabeth Laparco. Andrea Witham.
Thank you. First on the agenda is opening the public hearing. I will read the public announcement. Notice of public hearing before the Zoning Board of Appeals. Please take notice that the Village of Altamont Zoning Board of Appeals will hold a public hearing on June 17th, 2025 at 7 p.m. at the Altamont Village Community Room, 115 Main Street, Altamont, New York, to hear all interested persons concerning an appeal from the final determination of the Village of Altamont Zoning Officer, ZEO, with respect to and concerning the parking requirements, Section 35522E, for a proposed mixed-use development project at 120 Park Street, Village of Altamont, tax parcel 48.06-4-4, 37.18-6-3. The appeal requests relief reversing the ZEO interpretation that the relevant code section requires additional parking spaces and that an insufficient number of parking spaces were provided in the proposed project plan. Owner 120 Park LLC and Village Post LLC, zoned CBD. Plans open for public inspection at the village office during normal business hours. A copy of the Zoning Board of Appeals agenda and related materials will be available on the village website by Friday, June 13th, 2025 at www.altamontvillage.org. All people who desire to be heard regarding this appeal shall be heard either by attending the public hearing or by submitting written comments in advance of the public hearing to the Zoning Board of Appeals. Zoning Board of Appeals Secretary. Motion to open.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Without.
If you do a motion to open it, you can, if you want to have me just give a little intro.
Before we open it.
You can open it.
Okay. Okay. So can I have a motion to open the public hearing?
I'll make that motion.
I'll second.
Board Member Freeman.
In favor.
Board Member Litt.
In favor.
Board Member Laparco.
In favor.
Board Member Trout.
In favor.
Board Member Kinsey.
In favor.
Board Member Witham.
In favor.
And Chairperson Sullivan.
In favor. And before we begin, I would ask our council just to give a brief overview of what the scope is for tonight.
Thank you. So we're here tonight on an appeal from a determination of the Village Zoning Enforcement Officer. It's in regard to a proposed mixed-use development project. The Code Enforcement Officer, in receiving a special use permit application for that project, made a series of determinations regarding applicable code provisions and whether the concept plan that was submitted complied with the village's local zoning code. One of the four determinations that were made by the Code Enforcement Officer concerned the amount of parking that was proposed as part of the concept plan. And ultimately, that determination was that there was not sufficient on-site parking provided to satisfy the requirements of the Village of Altamont Code. The applicant subsequently appealed from that portion of the zoning enforcement officer's determination. They have presented their arguments in a petition for appeal, which has been now before the ZBA. Tonight, we'll begin the public hearing with the chairman's approval with hearing the applicant's petition for the appeal and their basis for the appeal. We also have the village's zoning enforcement officer here tonight who can explain how he reached his determination. The issue of the requisite number of parking spaces is the only issue that is before the Zoning Board of Appeals tonight. It's the only determination of the zoning enforcement officer that was appealed, and the only question that the ZBA can consider and determine on this appeal. So, I just wanted to, explain that so everyone can understand what the public hearing here is for tonight. It is limited to the question of whether or not a sufficient number of parking spaces was provided as part of the concept plan. And based on the public comments that are received at the hearing tonight and the information in the record that's been available to the ZBA and to members of the public, at the conclusion of the public hearing, the chairman will determine and the board will determine if the public hearing is going to be closed tonight, and then if they want to proceed with deliberations. The question that's before the Zoning Board of Appeals is whether or not to affirm, modify, or reverse the zoning enforcement officer's determination. That's the only question before the ZBA on this appeal. So if all agree, we'll have the applicant come up and present their petition and basis for the appeal.
Good evening, members of the Zoning Board. My name is Mary Beth Slevin, and I am here on behalf of 120 Park LLC with respect to the question that's before the board this evening. It's really a question of methodology. The methodology that's used to actually calculate what parking is required for a project, whether it's the project that's proposed for 120 Park or a different project. The zoning enforcement officer has a challenging job to try to navigate through those issues. But the zoning code does provide the parameters under which the calculation is supposed to occur. We did provide the board with the methodology that our engineers used to come up with the parking spaces that were proposed on the plan. And I can review those with the board. Essentially, there's a post office proposed on the property, and the parking for that particular use is, since it's a 1,500 square foot customer space, it's one space per 200 square feet, or 7.5 spaces when calculated. There's also mixed-use commercial, 4,427 square feet of customer space. And the calculation is one space per 200 square feet, which the calculation results in 22.1 spaces. The mixed-use residential with 6 units times 1.5 spaces as provided in the code equals 9 spaces when calculated out. The same thing for the residential building. There's 6 units multiplied by the 1.5 spaces required in the code comes to 9 spaces. So the total would be 47.6 spaces for those uses that I just referenced, with rounding up happening to 48 spaces. The code is very clear in terms of what's required. The code specifically says that there are, for multifamily use, the requirement is 1.5 spaces per unit. For business uses under 1,500 square feet, it's 1 space per 250 square feet of floor space. For offices, 1 space per 300 square feet of gross floor space. So in the materials that we provided the board, we looked at 3 different ways of actually coming to that calculation. And in each calculation, we were providing adequate parking based on the code requirements. There's a couple of things that are relevant for the board to understand. There's some legal axioms which are important to understand. The first of which is that it's settled in zoning codes, that a zoning code is to be construed in favor of the applicant. So if there's a question, it's the applicant who gets the benefit of the doubt. And I'm sure this board has heard that many times before. It also must be construed in accordance with the literal language of the code. What the interpretation of the code enforcement officer looked at a call out for 1.5 spaces per unit and automatically rounded that up to 2 spaces rather than waiting until the end of the calculation. So if there's 6 units, it would be 9 spaces. He calculated as 6 units, each of which requires 2 spaces before any calculation was done. That's inconsistent with not only the legal axioms that are applicable, but it's also inconsistent with the village code's own language. If you look at the off-site parking requirements under the code, what it talks about is finding optimum parking for projects, not maximum parking. It provides multiple opportunities for shared parking in when there's more than one structure or more than one use on a parcel. So the whole underlying philosophy is to provide what's necessary for parking, but the minimum amount of parking to make sure that you're not overburdening a project. That's what's proposed by the applicant. It's that optimum parking based on the specific and very clear language of the code in the context of the uses that are proposed. And we believe that based on that, we have provided sufficient parking and parking that's consistent with what the zoning code requires. We did solicit some information from the zoning enforcement officer from the town of Gilliland just to confirm that the methodology that we were proposing and that we're applying is consistent with what the town of Gilliland says. And I have a letter that I could submit to the board which confirms those calculations.
Thank you.
I've got copies of that for the board members.
Thank you. Sorry.
That's all right.
So I note, I'll let everyone just read that for a moment. And finally, I would just refer the board to section 355.22B of the zoning code, which specifically talks about the combination of uses and the methodology to be used for calculating the spaces. It specifically says, "The total requirements for off-street parking shall be the sum of the requirements for the various uses, unless it is established that staggered hours of use would justify modification. If a portion of a space is required, a full space shall be provided." That's probably the question, the sentence that's at issue here, is when does that portion of a space get determined? It would be inconsistent with the policies under the code and also with the general requirements under the code to round up before you've even started looking at how many spaces are going to be counted. If it says 1.5, it should be 1.5, and a roundup should only occur at the end of the calculation, not at the beginning. And I think that's the difference in terms of where the zoning enforcement officer is and this is. In every other town where we have looked at the parking, when there's a portion of a space that's allocated for a particular use, the calculation occurs for a roundup at the end of the process, not at the beginning. Rounding it up at the beginning of the process can only result in an overburden of the property and of the project for unnecessary parking. If it was meant to be 2 spaces, it would say 2 spaces. But it doesn't. It says 1.5, and it also says that it's important to look at what's the nominal parking, not the maximum. And for that reason, we would request the board to reverse the determination of the zoning enforcement officer and to find that the parking that's proposed and the interpretation of the parking for the project presented by the applicant is appropriate. Thank you.
Before we move on to hearing from our zoning officer, does anyone on the board have questions to the applicant?
Yes, I do. The zoning law says that parking spaces need to be provided for the employees of the businesses that are there. For example, the post office employees, and if there's like some commercial development, there's got to be spaces for the people who work at that commercial development.
Within the code, the only uses that require an allocation for employee parking are for offices, not for the retail space, because the contemplation of employees is already calculated into the square footage allocation for things like retail space, industrial spaces, things like that. The only code provision that expressly calls out a separate calculation for the employees is for offices, professional offices, dental offices, medical offices, things of that nature. Those aren't part of this project, but certainly if that would change, a calculation would be included, because you're absolutely right. Where the code calls for it, it has to be provided.
Before you go, save you a trip, I do have a question about the methodology of using 1,500 square feet customer space when the project is 6,000 for the post office. Why carve out just customer space?
Because the rest of it is, and Brett, maybe you can answer that more directly than I can. I believe it's because of the way the space in the building is allocated, but
in a post office, a majority of the space is allocated to bulk storage, for the bins and the mail and such, thus not requiring parking spaces. The one thing that was added into this that we've kind of kept out of the calculation on both ends, we have allocated 8 parking spaces for the post office vehicles where the mail delivery person can swap their vehicle out for that mail carrier vehicle, so that takes into account those areas. And that's why only 1,500 square feet, which actually is it's a pretty liberal amount of space for that particular type of use, but we wanted to be somewhat conservative in that, making sure that we had adequate parking.
Sir, can you state your name?
Brett Steenberg Consulting Engineering.
The Postal Service has a Space Requirements Handbook, AS-504, and it lists out very specifically the number of spaces per box. Was that consulted in your calculation?
No, it was not.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions?
When it says that in the handbook, is that in addition to the customer parking that they're talking about?
So page 34 of that handbook just lists out one space per 120 number one boxes, which is the size that's most common here. One space per 50 number two boxes. I didn't run that calculation to see what it would turn out to be. I just am curious. How come
Is that considered the whole parking requirement for the post office then, or is that in addition to?
From what I can tell,
Oh, okay.
yeah. Sure, come on up.
Jeff Thomas. The postal engineers reviewed all of our calculations, and they like what we did, and they approve what we did. Can you use the mic more? The postal engineers used all of, we actually worked on the whole project with them. They helped us design the parking and everything, so they were very happy, and they're very pleased with what we've come up with. When Brett mentioned those 8 additional spots, those are over the calculations that we've submitted. So there's 8 additional spots. You picked that up, correct? Okay. That's really, but the post office has their own calculations, and the calculations for their space were more than sufficient. It was more than they asked for in our lease.
Thank you. Okay, I'll ask Gary to come on up and explain his methodology.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Gary Goss. I'm the village's zoning enforcement official. So when I took an initial look at this project, excuse me, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on here. So I reviewed the code, the village code, several times, and you know, as the folks here said, the code is pretty specific on outlining the parking requirements. And in our village code and the zoning code, and I don't know if this is also in Guilderland's code or not, but related to just Altamont, there's a section in the code that it says if your parking is calling out for a partial space, you have to round to a full space. You can't count partial spaces. So I applied that methodology to each one of these projects, and as you can see in the documentation, I went through them separately, kind of how they have them broken out in the site statistics here. So I'll start with the post office up here. You know, I highlighted the 8 spaces, so they're one space per 200 square feet, and they came up with 7.5 spaces, and you can't have a half space. So I rounded that up to 8 spaces. And then use 2 for the mixed use building, that's this building over here. They had, you know, the commercial space and then the 6 units. They put in here 1.5 spaces per residential unit. Now, that's kind of the item that's in question here. So looking at these residential housing here for the families, you know, most houses have 2 vehicles in the house. So to me, it would make common sense to round that up to 2 vehicles per residence. So I did that, and that came out to, instead of the 9 spaces, it came to 12 spaces. And then the other residential multifamily building here, I applied that same methodology to my calculations. So they had 1.5 spaces per unit, and I rounded that up to 2 times the 6 would be 12 spaces, and they had accounted for 9. So when you add all of the uses, all the spaces up, what I got, my math, I came up with 62 parking spaces were required. And as you can see on the documentation, I went through and I numbered all the spaces. And what I realized after the fact was I missed 2 spaces right here in the middle that were right out in front of the parking post office, I should say. So on my calculations, I said that I thought they were 9 spaces short, where actually they're only 7 spaces short because I missed these 2. I don't know how I missed these 2. I went through and numbered every spot here, so I apologize for that. But that kind of gives everybody the idea of how I came up with my calculations.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions from the board?
Yes. If the code says if the code says 1.5 spaces, why do you go up to 2?
Well, there's another section in the code that says if you're calculating parking and there's a partial space accounted for, you have to round up. So that's, I guess, what the interpretation question is here. I'm rounding up at that initial 1.5 to 2, and where the applicant is saying, you got to add all this stuff up and then round up at the end. And it'll change the parking requirements, depending on which way you look at it. So look, like I said, you know, for me, making my determination, especially for these with the apartments, you know, they're family units, they're going to most likely have 2 cars per unit, and that just made sense to me, so I applied that methodology through all of my calculations for the project. And the other piece, I mean, it's not in the code, but as you know now, that area is pretty parked up, if you will, with all the apartment buildings down the end of the Park Street there. So, you know, I thought that it would be appropriate to ensure that there was enough parking for this entire project and not just for pieces of it. That's the other common sense thing that I took into account when I was going through this.
Thank you.
Yep.
Before we open it up to the public for comment, I would point out part of our code 355-38, which is special regulations and, trying to get the proper name, special standards and requirements. And section L is multiple family developments. And Part 8 says paved off-street parking areas shall be provided as follows. And requirement B says 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit shall be required. Yes. Who would like to come up first? Remember to please state your name and try to keep the comments focused on the issue at hand.
Name is Stuart Linendahl, 109 Park Street. A couple things. Talking about the post office, I live across from the post office, and I've been, over time, counting the number of cars that employees use and park in what I call a Ketchum's lot, and there are 7 to 9 on different days. And none of those cars take the spot of where a mailing van would be parked. So there are 4 mailing vans. Those are vacant all the time during the day. And in fact, it says mailing trucks only can park there. So those spots are eliminated. There is 1 mail truck, mail van that is privately owned, but that's also parked there overnight all the time. Often on Saturdays in particular, the parking for the customers, there are not enough spaces, so they end up going into Ketchum's lot. And that's not a problem because that's there. So that the idea of the employees needing a space is pretty priority. When I went through and looked up the ratio of parking spaces to residents, there are a variety of ways of calculating it. May I ask if there are 2-bedroom units in this proposal? In the residencies? I didn't hear what the answer was.
The applicant said that there's a variety of 1 and 2
All
family.
right. When it's 2 or more, the common use is using the number 2 for the units. If there were more than 2, then they go up to 2.5 units. And they also talk about having a 25% spaces for required spaces for guest parking. So I don't know if that's any part of the calculations here. I mean, that's from my research. And the idea of the zoning official using the two-unit, 2-car spacing for unit makes sense because the transportation, public transportation is pretty non-existent in Altamont. And if a family needs to go to work, doctor's appointments, anything outside the village, it's usually 2 cars. I'll ask the people on the board, how many cars are in your families? I have 2. Most of my neighbors have 2. On the other side, there are 3. I mean, we're in a world where we become dependent on the vehicles that we use all the time. So I agree with the calculation of using a whole number of 2 instead of 1.5. And if it goes up to 3 bedrooms, then it's 2.5 unit spaces. That's my say on the parking. Thank you.
Thank you. We'd invite the next person to come up who'd like to speak.
So how long ago were the zoning regulations changed?
Could you please state your name?
I'm sorry, my name is Doris White, and I have a resident at Creekside on Park Street.
Thank you, Doris. It looks like the most updated version is 2022.
When?
2022?
Oh, really? And that's when they changed it?
I don't have information on what specifically was changed, but I know that the most recent copy that I have is from 2022.
The reason I'm asking was I live at Creekside. We have 8 parking spots, and we have 8 units. And I know we've been using some of his property for parking, which we're not going to be able to use, but somebody approved that for Troy Miller. And I don't know what the rules or regulations were back then. So it seems to me if we have one, and these apartments have 1.5, some of them are going to have 1 car, some are going to have 2, so it would equal out.
Jeff Thomas again. I just wanted to say that in the village, in the central business district, she's right, Creekside has 8 units and 8 parking spots. And I think that was built probably 10 years ago, 12 years ago, something like that. The wine shop has a mixed use. It has a wine shop and has a unit above it for residential. That has 0 off-street parking. Farm Family Tap and Tavern in the Central Business District has a commercial restaurant and 3 units, and that has 0 dedicated parking. Park House Apartments, a project that I developed and own today, that project has 8 residential units and 1 commercial unit, and it has 11 spaces. I also built the Altamont Plaza, and those calculations were all rounded at the end. Every project I've done, Brandel Meadows, 72 units. It was 1.5 spots per unit. Those are condominium, 3 bedrooms. It was used at 1.5, and then it was the total number that we came up at the end, if it was 72 or if it was 92.5 to use, I'm not giving the exact calculations, it was rounded up to 93. Never have I been asked, and I've talked to Gilvin as well, in my history have they rounded up prior to the calculation. And again, it would overburden. Our business district is not all parking. It would be a sea of parking lots. And there's also a provision in the code that allows us to use municipal lots and off-street parking, which this project's not doing. With the 1.5 spots per unit, we have a surplus of parking. Plus, we have the 8 units we dedicated to, 8 parking spots we dedicated to the employees of the post office. So we have a sea of parking. And I know it's not part of this consideration, but we also own the key bank, the old key bank next door, and that could be allowed for shared parking. So we have a lot of parking. And there's also the Ketchum lot, which the post office rents, and that has, I'm guessing, I think, what does that have, Brett? 12 or 14 parking spots additional. So this project has a sea of parking compared to all the other businesses that are currently in the central business district. Any questions? Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Mary Beth Slevin again. I just wanted to note the reference to the multifamily development. This project is not a multifamily development. It is a mixed-use project with multiple different types of uses. The zoning code provides for multifamily housing as a general concept of 1.5 spaces per unit. The multifamily development, as a specific type of project calls for 2 spaces per unit. So there's a clear distinction within the code itself as to what the parking requirements are. So I just wanted to make that note. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Don Cropsey, and just so the board knows, I was the building inspector for the town of Gilliland for 32 years, as well as the zoning administrator, and then also the building inspector for the village of Altamont. And when we received applications for special use permits for projects, we always calculated the total number of parking spaces required, and if there was a partial space after that calculation, we rounded up after the total. And in the current zoning law, the zoning law says the off-street parking shall be the sum of the requirements for the various uses. And then it goes on to say, if a portion of a space is required, a full space shall be provided, which is the same methodology of calculating the total number of parking spaces, and if there's a partial space, you round up at the end. So.
Tim Pierce, 119 Park. Does the code that this gentleman read earlier, does that read the same exact way for Guilderland, or is that not a part of Guilderland's code?
Gilliland does not have that provision
Okay.
that says to round up, but we always round it up. And the same goes for, in Gilliland, there's a provision that requires, or it limits the number of parking spaces. There's a maximum number.
Right.
And if it's a partial spot, let's say 10.5 for maximum, they round it down.
Okay, but so just because Guilderland had it that way doesn't mean that Altamont would have it the same way, correct? Based on their underlying rules and.
It's not there. It used to be in the town of Gilliland's code, but they took it out.
Okay, okay, so there's a distinction. All right, thank you.
Are there any other residents or community members that wish to speak?
Jim, don't forget you got the letter the
Oh,
other day.
thank you.
Want to read that?
Yes, absolutely. There was a letter submitted that I will read into the record. From resident Linda Bell. Dear Village of Altamont, I will not be able to attend the meeting on June 17th because I'll be working. I would like to have you hear my concerns of parking for this project. I live at Creekside Condos at 119 Park Street, and we only have one parking spot per unit, and it is already a problem to park if you have company over or if you have 2 cars per unit. When the Altamont Fair Week, parking is a hassle and traffic. So I can't imagine if you let them go through with this project, what it will be like with traffic and parking. The street is already narrow and can't imagine how it will be when cars will be parked on the street all the time. Thank you, Linda Bell, homeowner, 119 Park. Seeing no other community members wishing to speak, how does the board feel about closing the public hearing at this time? Any issues? Okay, can I have a motion to close the public hearing?
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Board Member Freeman.
In favor.
Board Member Littman.
In favor.
Board Member Loparco.
In favor.
Board Member Cho.
In favor?
Board Member Pinsey.
In favor.
Board Member Witham.
In favor.
And Chairperson Zoll.
In favor. So at this point, the public hearing is closed, and we can decide on whether to uphold or modify or reject.
You know, to assist the board if it's moving on to deliberations, I did prepare a draft resolution. The resolution, has a blank where we make the decision if we're going to affirm, modify, or reverse, and there's a blank page on the back where we can discuss written findings of the board. So I prepared this as a, kind of worksheet that we could use if the board did want to proceed with deliberations. So if you're agreeable, we can do that. I can pass these around. Again, it's really just a form. And if you like, I can take notes of the written findings if the board ultimately wants to move forward with adopting the resolution tonight. I do have extra copies also if Mary Beth or if any members of the public want to follow along. It's really just a shell, but happy to provide it. Thank you. So I'll just give a quick, now that the board members have it in front of them. There's an introduction on the resolution, just giving the background, we're hearing the appeal. There's a place where we would have the board adopt written findings, which are incorporated as part of the resolution. You'll see right now that page is blank. And then the second point, based on the findings, the ZBA does hereby, and there's, the choice is to affirm, modify, or reverse the determination of the ZEO, and we can add any additional information if the board wants to move forward.
Well, I think we should talk about our thoughts on it, deliberate, and
My sense is that if the code says 1.5 parking spaces per unit, and I think we ought to stick with that. And I appreciate the applicant's statements that you don't want to have excess asphalt in the village. So I would be inclined to support the applicant in this case. Also, the impervious surface of the project is, I think, 70% of the area, and the village code, I believe, says that there's got to be at least 30% that's pervious. So if more parking spaces were added, that would cut into the pervious area of the project.
so one thought I had was that the discrepancy was 7, right? Which could have been accounted for with the 20% stipulation in our code of municipal parking. So if the applicant had included that in their proposal, there would be no issue.
Right.
So I think that fact means that there's parking available for them to claim it's there.
When I made my determinations, they didn't include that as part of the project, so I couldn't just assume they were.
Correct.
taking that. So in my interpretation, I don't want to speak for them, but they didn't have it on the documentation.
If I could comment on that.
proposed, isn't it?
This is the applicant.
The board can hear additional information.
The obligation of the applicant is to propose parking that's consistent with the underlying requirements of the code. And that was what was done. To the extent that a reduction is possible, that's really a different conversation. And that's driven by, is there a need for bank parking, or is there a desire for bank parking? Possibly to provide for opportunities for parking in the future, should it be needed, based on what the anecdotal evidence of the usage is once the project is developed. But the project as proposed is required to comply with the literal language of the zoning code, which is what this did. So we appreciate the perspective that the board and certainly the zoning enforcement officer wants to make sure that there's adequate parking, because it's a concern within the village. But that doesn't provide the purview to then unilaterally change the language in the code to meet those kinds of desires or wishes. The code itself looks to have optimal but not maximum parking. It's very clear that on multiple occasions within the section dealing with off-site parking, the code talks about making sure that the parking is only what's adequate, not what would be otherwise necessary if we had a wish list of parking spaces. So we asked the board to look at it from that perspective, from the literal language of the code, rather than from a broader scope of what might be we want. Reductions can be done on a different basis. That's a completely different analysis, completely different review. The application has to deal with the literal language of the code. And that literal language, as I said earlier, is to be construed in favor of the applicant. It's, when there's a question, it's the applicant that gets the benefit of the doubt, not the municipality. Thanks.
Does the board have any more comments or questions? Then I would ask if the board feels comfortable now voting on a proposal.
If the board is going to, vote on a proposal, we would need a motion to adopt a resolution either affirming, modifying, or reversing, and have that be the motion, and then have everyone vote on that motion.
Okay.
And if it doesn't carry, the board can entertain, other motions.
Then I guess I'll ask the board for a motion to reverse the zoning officer's decision in favor of the applicant.
I'll make a motion.
I'll second.
So, I'm sorry, who was it?
Andrew.
Okay. And,
Second. In favor.
So an aye means reverse?
Reversing the decision from our officer in favor of the applicant.
Okay.
That's the motion on the
All right.
table.
okay, so, board member Wynn?
Aye,
So you approve?
yes.
Okay. All right, board member Loparco?
Aye.
Board member Cho?
Approve.
Board member Kinsey?
Approve. In favor.
And Chairperson Sullivan.
In favor.
So the board has adopted a resolution on motion to reverse the ZEO's determination in favor of the methodology used by the applicant. If the board is agreeable, I can reflect that in the written findings and also just the discussion that we had prior to the motion, if the board is agreeable that that was the findings intended to be attached to the resolution.
Sounds good. Before we move on to the next business, I appreciate the number of people that came out tonight and spoke, and understand that there's a lot of feelings and thoughts about this project, and encourage you to follow along as this project continues. The scope of this evening was very narrow. So thank you. Next on our agenda is to consider changing the date for the July zoning board meeting from Tuesday, July 22nd to Tuesday, July 29th at 7 p.m. Could I have a motion to accept that change?
I'll make that motion.
Second.
I think Elizabeth made the motion first, so.
Oh,
Okay, and second.
all right.
Okay, thank you. Roll call, Board Member Freeman.
In favor.
Board Member Whitson.
In favor.
In favor.
Board Member Cho.
Approve.
Board Member Pinsky.
In favor.
Board Member Wickham.
In favor.
Chairperson Sullivan.
In favor. And finally, everyone's had an opportunity to review the minutes from the previous meeting. Does anyone need more time? Then could I please have a motion to accept the minutes as written?
I'll motion that.
Second.
Roll call, Board Member Freeman.
In favor.
Board Member Lang.
In favor.
Board Member Lopez.
In favor.
Board Member Cho.
Favor.
Board Member Pinsky.
In favor.
Board Member Wickham.
In favor.
Chairperson Sullivan.
In favor. And then finally, unless anyone has any other business, a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
And I'll second it.
All right.
Board Member Freeman.
In favor.
In favor.
In favor.
In favor.
In favor.
In favor.